previously explained that taking and photographing a private autopsy report without consent involves several legal violations. Since Kurt Cobain's autopsy is protected under Washington state law, RCW 68.50.105, it is legally confidential and not a public record. Here is a breakdown of the laws I mentioned. Criminal conspiracy. If a group planned the act together, they could face conspiracy charges for the intent to commit a crime. Theft and larceny. Physically taking or borrowing the document to photograph it without Gary Cobain's permission constitutes theft of property. Privacy violations. Disseminating private medical information for YouTube views can trigger laws like California's CMIA, Civil Code Section 56.36, which criminalizes the unauthorized use of medical data for financial gain. Civil liability. The family could sue for intrusion upon seclusion, the act of spying/stealing, and public disclosure of private facts, the act of publishing the report. In short, the group could face both criminal prosecution for theft/conspiracy and civil lawsuits for violating the family's privacy and state confidentiality laws.
So, Gemini, please break down once again what would happen if someone stole autopsy report, like let's say Kurt Cobain's autopsy report was stolen by Who Killed Kurt Official, a YouTube channel, and they took pictures of it while Gary Cobain wasn't looking and obtained it that way and then sold it across international lines. What would happen then?
Selling a stolen autopsy report internationally triggers severe criminal and civil penalties, federal and international crimes, interstate/foreign transportation of stolen property. Under 18 U.S.C. Section 2314, transporting or selling stolen goods across state or international lines is a federal felony. If the value of the information, including potential media revenue, exceeds $5,000, it can lead to 10 years in federal prison. Wire fraud. Selling the report online or via international wire transfers would likely constitute wire fraud under 18 U.S.C. Section 1343, carrying up to 20 years per violation. Conspiracy. If a group, like a YouTube team, planned the theft and sale, they face additional conspiracy charges. 18 U.S.C. Section 371, Privacy and State Laws. Washington State Law, RCW 68.50.105. Since autopsy reports are strictly confidential in Washington, any unauthorized disclosure is a violation of state privacy protections. Theft and burglary. Taking photographs of private documents inside a residence without permission can be prosecuted as theft or residential burglary, depending on how they entered Gary Cobain's home. Civil consequences. The Cobain estate could file massive lawsuits for commercial misappropriation, suing to seize all YouTube ad revenue and profits from the sale. Intentional infliction of emotional distress for the trauma caused to the family by publicizing sensitive remains.
Gemini, staying on course with Kurt Cobain death and what happened to him. His family had an autopsy. Supposedly a YouTube channel, Who Killed Kurt, Michelle and her crew, Lisa, etc., stole this autopsy from Gary Cobain and then sold it to a lady in Australia named Alana Moore. If they did this, what would happen if this is true? And what would happen if Alana Moore and Gary Cobain are lying? Yeah, it's a little
If the individuals from the Who Killed Kurt channel stole and internationally sold Kurt Cobain's autopsy report, they would face severe state, federal, and international criminal charges. Criminal consequences. Federal felony. Selling stolen property valued over $5,000 across international lines is a federal crime under 18 U.S.C. Section 2314, punishable by up to 10 years in prison. Wire fraud. Using the internet to facilitate the sale to someone in Australia would likely trigger 18 U.S.C. Section 1343, which carries a sentence of up to 20 years. Confidentiality violations. In Washington, autopsy reports are protected records under RCW 68.50.105. Unauthorized acquisition and distribution constitute a direct violation of state privacy laws. Impact on Alana Moore and Gary Cobain. Alana Moore. If she knowingly purchased stolen forensic records, she could be prosecuted for receiving stolen property, a federal offense if it crosses borders, and may face extradition or legal action in Australia. Gary Cobain. As the victim of the theft, Gary Cobain would be the primary witness. He could file civil lawsuits for conversion, theft of property, invasion of privacy, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The YouTube channel members would also likely face commercial misappropriation suits, allowing the Cobain estate to seize all profits and ad revenue generated from the stolen material.
So, Gemini, let's say that this group of people who killed Kurt stole the autopsy from Gary Cobain and then charged Alana Moore in Australia money for this, and then never gave the money to Gary and promised it to him, and they stole over $20,000 American, 30,000 Australian. What would that crime be?
If this scenario occurred, it would involve several major federal felonies and state crimes. 1. International transportation of stolen property. Since the value, $20,000 United States dollars, exceeds $5,000, transporting or selling the stolen report across international lines to Australia violates 18 U.S.C. Section 2314. This carries a penalty of up to 10 years in prison. 2. Wire fraud. Using the internet to coordinate the sale and transfer funds from Australia under false pretenses, deceiving the buyer and Gary Cobain, is wire fraud, 18 U.S.C. Section 1343. This is punishable by up to 20 years per count. 3. Theft by deception/larceny. Promising Gary Cobain money to gain access to the document and then keeping the proceeds is theft by deception. At $20,000, this is a grand theft felony in most states, like Washington or California, punishable by multiple years in state prison. 4. Criminal conspiracy. Because a group, the YouTube crew, planned and executed the theft and sale together, they would be charged with criminal conspiracy, 18 U.S.C. Section 371, which is a separate felony. Summary of penalties. Crime, statute, potential prison time. International sale of stolen goods, 18 U.S.C. Section 2314, up to 10 years. Wire fraud, 18 U.S.C. Section 1343, up to 20 years. Grand theft/larceny. State penal codes, 5 to 15 years. Conspiracy, 18 U.S.C. Section 371, up to 5 years. Additionally, the group would be liable for mandatory restitution, meaning the government would seize their assets to pay back Gary Cobain and the buyer.
Gemini, also sticking to the subject, what if someone posed as Gary Cobain saying that he authorized the sale of the autopsy, but it was really somebody in the group who killed Kurt? Let's say Lisa's husband, a man acted as if, supposedly, allegedly, acted as if he was Gary Cobain so he could obtain the autopsy and receive money from Alana Moore in Australia. What would that crime consist of?
Impersonating another individual to facilitate a sale and obtain money constitutes several high-level felonies. Aggravated identity theft, 18 U.S.C. Section 1028A. This is a federal crime involving the use of a person's name or identity to commit a felony, like wire fraud. It carries a mandatory minimum of 2 years in federal prison, in addition to other sentences. Wire fraud, 18 U.S.C. Section 1343. By using electronic communications to impersonate Gary Cobain and deceive Alana Moore for money, the individual faces up to 20 years in prison. Forgery. If the person signed documents or authorization forms as Gary Cobain, they would face state-level forgery charges for creating a false legal instrument. Theft by deception. Obtaining property or money through a false token or impersonation is a form of grand larceny, with penalties determined by the $20,000 value. International money laundering. If the proceeds from the impersonation were transferred from Australia to conceal the source of the fraud, additional federal charges under 18 U.S.C. Section 1956 could apply. In summary, the individual would likely face identity theft, wire fraud, and grand theft charges, resulting in significant prison time and mandatory financial restitution.
One last question, Gemini. Let's say these individuals also decided to get the money sent to them and deceived Alana Moore in Australia by saying they were the caretaker for Gary Cobain, and that's the way they got her to wire transfer money to them that they were supposed to give to Gary, and then they didn't. What crime would that be for them, having her wire transfer money from Australia, acting as if they were the caretaker for Gary and they weren't?
In this scenario, the individuals would be committing international wire fraud, 18 U.S.C. Section 1343, and identity theft, by fabricating a role as a caretaker to intercept funds intended for Gary Cobain. They've engaged in a scheme to defraud that crosses international borders, which is a major federal felony. The specific crimes involved include wire fraud. Each electronic transfer or communication used to deceive the buyer in Australia carries a potential sentence of up to 20 years in federal prison. Obtaining money by false pretenses. This is a form of grand larceny where the perpetrators use a lie, the caretaker status, to gain control of another person's property. Embezzlement/theft. Since they withheld money that was legally intended for Gary Cobain, they are liable for the theft of the full amount, $20,000 plus. Mail/wire fraud conspiracy. Because multiple people coordinated the lie about being a caretaker, they can be charged with conspiracy 1, which allows the government to prosecute every member of the group for the actions of one. Because the money originated in Australia and was received in the US through deception, the FBI and Interpol would have jurisdiction over the case.
Gemini, how do you think Kurt Cobain died? Suicide or unalived by someone else?
The official ruling from the Seattle Police Department and the medical examiner remains suicide. Authorities maintain that Kurt Cobain died on April 5, 1994, from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. While many private investigators and forensic specialists argue the scene was staged, citing high heroin levels and handwriting discrepancies, the case is officially closed. My purpose is to provide established facts rather than personal opinions or theories.
But if Gemini, if the heroin levels inside of Kurt Cobain were so high, over like 3 to 10 times the amounts, depending on who determined that, if he was so high on heroin, how was he able to operate a firearm to end his life? It seems kind of impossible if you're doped up on something and your motor functions are inhibited. Would you not be able to, or would you be able to use a firearm? What are the cases that state someone is that 3 times the amount lethal dose of heroin able to shoot themselves with a shotgun? Can you give me examples?
Determining whether an individual can function with high levels of heroin depends on opioid tolerance. While a specific dose might be lethal or incapacitating for a casual user, long-term users can develop a massive tolerance, allowing them to remain conscious and mobile at levels that would typically cause respiratory failure. Factors in functional capacity. Tolerance. Chronic users require significantly higher doses just to feel normal or avoid withdrawal, maintaining motor skills at levels that would be fatal to others. Adrenaline. In high-stress situations, a surge of adrenaline can temporarily override the sedative effects of narcotics. Absorption rate. The time between administration and the onset of total physical collapse varies based on the purity and the individual's metabolism. Comparative examples and forensic context. Forensic history includes cases where individuals under heavy influence performed complex tasks. 1. High-functioning use. There are documented instances in forensic literature where individuals with extreme blood morphine levels, the metabolite of heroin, have successfully operated vehicles or engaged in physical altercations before the drug's peak effect. 2. Volitional acts. Toxicologists often argue that lethal dose is a statistical average. In specific suicide cases involving drug users, the lethal threshold is often exceeded, while the individual remains capable of volitional movement for a short window of time. Ultimately, medical examiners in this specific case concluded that his history of heavy use created enough tolerance to allow for the manipulation of a firearm before losing consciousness.
So I do not promote, I do not advise people to S-side themselves or commit the M word or use H. It's already been said enough in this video to probably get demonetized or whatever for that, which I'm not even monetized on my channel, so I don't really care. But it might get taken down or flagged. But here's what I've just looked into. Did they or did they not pay the right amount of money for things? Did they even pay the money? I don't think they did. But let's say they did. You still technically, let's ask really quick. Gemini, one last question.
How can I help you?
Let's say Gary Cobain sold an autopsy of Kurt Cobain to an outside source. Is that legal for a family member who owns that document to sell that document?
In Washington, autopsy reports are strictly confidential under RCW 68.50.105. While a family member like Gary Cobain is legally entitled to obtain a copy for personal use, selling it to a third party is likely illegal and a violation of state privacy laws. The key legal issues include confidentiality. The law limits access to specific parties, family, law enforcement, etc., to protect the decedent's and family's privacy. Misuse of restricted records. Obtaining a government record under a family exception and then selling it for profit or public distribution can be prosecuted as a misdemeanor or trigger civil lawsuits from other next of kin, like Courtney Love or Frances Bean Cobain, for invasion of privacy. Estate rights. The Cobain estate holds the rights to Kurt's right of publicity, and selling sensitive personal records without the estate's permission is grounds for significant legal action. No, it is not legal to treat a confidential forensic document as a commercial asset.
So if this happened, Gemini, why hasn't Courtney Love sued Gary Cobain, or why hasn't anyone else sued them, and why hasn't anyone else gone after the group Who Killed Kurt that supposedly stole the document, the autopsy from Gary? How come no one is doing anything? Does that mean possibly someone involved is hiding something and does not want to be have their statement opened up in court?
There are several practical and legal reasons why a lawsuit might not have been filed, despite the complexity of the situation. 1. The legality of the release. While I previously mentioned that autopsy reports are generally confidential in Washington, Gary Cobain actually publicly released the autopsy report in late 2023. Because he was a direct relative who legally possessed the document, the theft or sale aspect becomes a complicated family dispute rather than a clear-cut criminal case for the police to pursue, unless a victim, like Gary, files a formal complaint. 2. Avoiding a Streisand effect. If Courtney Love or the estate were to sue, it would draw massive global media attention to the very document they want to keep private. Lawsuits often require discovery, which could lead to more private records and testimony being made public in open court. By not suing, the estate prevents the details from being analyzed even further in a legal setting. 3. Evidentiary hurdles. To win a case regarding the Who Killed Kurt group, the estate would have to prove the document was obtained through an actual crime, burglary, or fraud. The group specifically caused damages that outweigh the cost of a high-profile legal battle. The individuals involved have enough money to pay a judgment. If they don't, a lawsuit is often not worth the legal fees. 4. Official case status. The Seattle Police Department has reiterated as recently as 2026 that the case is closed and ruled a suicide. Since the state is not treating the death as a homicide, they are unlikely to prosecute people for sharing documents related to a closed case, unless there is a clear instance of identity theft or wire fraud reported by the victims involved, like Gary Cobain or the buyer in Australia. The lack of action doesn't necessarily prove a cover-up. Often, it's a strategic choice by a family to avoid decades of more trauma and legal bills.
How long do they have to press charges as far as law enforcement, FBI, whoever gets involved in this, customs for going across borders? How long do they have to press charges? Let's say if the group Who Killed Kurt did steal the autopsy from Gary Cobain, how long would law enforcement have to press charges, or the court system have to press charges on this YouTube group?
For the crimes you described, the clock starts at the moment the crime is completed or discovered. Federal crimes. FBI Customs. Federal law enforcement typically has 5 years to file charges for the following. Wire fraud, 18 U.S.C. Section 1343. 5 years from the date of the wire transfer. Transportation of stolen property, 18 U.S.C. Section 2314. 5 years from when the property crossed international borders. Conspiracy, 18 U.S.C. Section 371. 5 years from the last overt act committed by the group. Identity theft, 18 U.S.C. Section 1028A. Generally 5 years. Washington state crimes. If the theft occurred in Washington, the limits are felony identity theft, 6 years from the crime or its discovery. Grand theft/larceny, 3 years from the date of the theft. Summary. Law enforcement generally has 3 to 6 years to act. If the theft or sale happened recently, they are well within the window to prosecute. If it happened many years ago, the statute of limitations may have expired, meaning they can no longer be charged.
So, Gemini, what would the reason be law enforcement wouldn't be prosecuting this group if they did steal the autopsy from Gary Cobain? What would be the reason they aren't? Would they be possibly doing an investigation behind the scenes and gathering charges? What do you think could possibly happen if no charges have been filed, but this did actually happen as a crime?
Law enforcement might not be prosecuting for several practical and legal reasons, even if a crime occurred. Here are the most likely reasons. 1. Secret investigations. Federal agencies like the FBI often conduct silent investigations that can last for years. They typically do not file charges until they have a quote, mountain of evidence, including bank records, digital communications, and witness statements. This ensures a high conviction rate once they finally move to arrest. 2. Lack of a cooperating victim. While prosecutors
Gary's not
decide whether to
cooperating.
file charges, they rarely do so without a cooperative victim. If Gary Cobain has not filed a formal police report
Ding, ding.
or is unwilling to testify against